Welcome all. Thank you so much for taking our time and being part of the making of modern heritage in South Asia. I am Marvi Mazhar, an architect practicing in Karachi. I'm going to talk a little bit about the project, and then we will move on with our format, and my colleagues will guide you through how this webinar will work through. Pakistan Chowk Community Center came into being in 2016, where we started off through as a bunch of advisors and architects, urban planners and thinkers of how public space can be revived through intervention and look at Old Town from the perspective of slight changes and thinking of activation of a public space. From here, we started collaborating with the local artists, residents, and proposed a couple of projects like Old Town Making, Spoken History, as well as cultural dialogue. This chalk, which was a public space in the center of Old Town in the paper market area, as well as the Rambagh quarter, turned out to be a space of experiment, a space which led towards a lot of discourse in thinking of cultural making and arts, and as well as a structure which was missing in outdoor spaces. So from here, what we did was we started this project called Heritage Walk Karachi, which was the output of Old Town Mapping and Spoken History. And Heritage Walk Karachi became a Sunday event, which not only advocated towards restoration and preservation, but also became a whistleblower between the government and the civil society, highlighting the issues, disruption, the rupture between all these parameters that were taking place in any city which is complex as any making of South Asian city like Karachi, Mumbai, Calcutta, Dhaka, where the development takes over and the making of heritage or restoration of heritage is the back end body. So Pakistan Chowk Community Center has initiated this webinar, which is a second round of this tenure of last year we had out on thinking about restoration and preservation. This year we're thinking about modern heritage from the idea of different lenses. And this has led to a very interesting conversation which gets uploaded onto our YouTube channel and also becomes a report writing for the government, where we propose these minutes and show them and tell them that this is how it's done all over and how we can even think in alliance. So the community and the alliance becomes a very important factor. On this note, I'm going to welcome you all. So thank you again, Randhir, Kylie, and Mahanur for taking our time and coming and showing your work, which means a lot to us. This webinar, once gets uploaded, also is used in academic spaces in universities as part of lecture series. So your work and in togetherness, we all think and kind of think about in making a future. So again, your work is very important for us to learn from. On this note, I'm going to let my colleagues talk more about the making of modern heritage. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, everyone. The topic of today's discussion, as you all know, is the echoes and ethos in modernity. After World War II, newly independent states pursued nationalization projects to stabilize the post-colonial nations before transitioning to free market economies. This period ushered in global cultural influences and the rise of new media such as comics, cinema, and vinyl records. Cultural shifts extended beyond media to encompass various aspects of daily life, evident in areas like Saddar in Karachi and Chandni Chowk in Delhi, where traditional practices and crafts, for example, palmists, cobblers, barbers, and hawkers, exist alongside relatively modern plazas and malls. However, as heavy gentrification takes place in these spaces, those who keep heritage and cultural practices alive get displaced. The questions we want to ask in this session are, how have the tangible and intangible spaces around these trends evolved? And what impact have they had on people's lives? Can this grassroots cultural multiplicity help us configure a new understanding of what constitutes heritage? How can modern art and photography shape our understanding of living heritage? We hope that today's panel can offer us some insight into these questions with their own unique perspectives and practices. First, I will be introducing our three panelists respectively before inviting them to speak. Following their talk, my fellow interns will offer a few words of reflection before we move on to the next speaker. Just as a small note, my apologies in advance, but in case you go over time, we may have to give you a gentle reminder just so we can have enough time for questions at the end. With that, I'm so pleased to announce our first speaker of the day. Ms. Kylie Gilchrist is a visiting lecturer at the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Khan University, Karachi. She recently completed a PhD on the work of Rashid Arain between 1950s Karachi and 1970s London at the University of Manchester. Her writing has appeared in publications such as Art Margins, New German Critique, E-Flux Criticism, and more. Ms. Gilchrist, thank you so much for joining us today. If you could, please share with us some words about your work as an individual and with your initiative, and how this contributes to our discussion.
Presenting aspects of my research on Rashid Arain from my PhD project, which I'm now continuing through research in Karachi and in London towards a book project. I'll just present a few, I'll kind of weave some aspects of Rashid Arain's biography into this presentation for those who aren't familiar, but I'll say that Rashid Arain is known as a pioneering artist born in Karachi and based in London since the mid-1960s. He's also known for his curatorial work as the founding editor of publications Black Phoenix and Third Text, and in general as a polemicist against Eurocentrism and racism in art. So I think it's really interesting to consider Arain in this context of this panel because his early years really index exactly this kind of cultural and critical practices that were enabled by this multi-class space that we're thinking about here today, particularly in the early period of post-colonial Karachi. And I'd like to then present 4 spaces that I think are key to what we could consider Rashid Arain's education in the broad sense. And this included his scientific education. He actually trained as an engineer in Karachi in the 1950s and 1960s. And he also pursued a self-taught artistic practice in this period. So I'd like to present these 4 spaces that I've identified, and secondly, to consider how these spaces constitute aspects of Karachi's post-colonial heritage and the questions about preservation and access that they raise. So the first site I'll present is the United States Information Services Library, where Arain began semi-formal art classes. This was a site that was part of the Cold War project of cultural influence of projecting soft power. The USIS library was installed at the temporary US Embassy on M.A. Jinnah Road. And it was initially a small site and grew in its activities, particularly after 1953, 1954, when the US intensified its kind of Cold War soft power and attempts to build closer ties with Pakistan. So I think what's interesting, though, about the site as an early space of Rashid Arain's artistic education is that although modernist American art was quite a prominent aspect of Cold War cultural influence projects, Rashid Arain actually trained with a painter named Nasim Kazi, who was a student of the painter Anamolka Ahmed, who was a British painter who moved to Pakistan and was really practicing in the tradition of European realism. So there's quite a layered, kind of layering of imperial formations here that I think is quite interesting. So I think the site didn't connect Rashid Arain to the most cutting edge international artistic trends, but it did connect him to Karachi's artistic communities. The second site is the context and the institutions of Rashid Arain's technical education. And between 1954 and 1956, he completed a degree in science science at the DJ Sindh Government Science College, and subsequently a degree in civil engineering at NED University, which are, of course, next to each other. And both schools were respected colonial era institutions of engineering education, but they were also particularly important in the context of the technical development initiatives that were part of the Cold War context. And the start of Rashid Arain's scientific education actually directly occurred in the same year as Pakistan formally ratified diplomatic diplomatic and military ties with the US. It was the year that the Defense Pact CETA was ratified. And it was also the year that a team of development economists from Harvard University, called the Harvard Advisory Group, started advising Pakistan on its technical and industrial development. So the Harvard Advisory Group began to advise the country on the first 5-year development plan. And I think there's a quote from the first page of this plan, which I think really encapsulates its mission, which is to accomplish, to quote it, an accelerated movement from a largely technologically backward and feudalistic stage into the modern era of advanced technology, now on the threshold of the atomic age. So part of this project required quite a lot of engineering expertise. Arain, as an engineering and training, was very much a desired part of this project. And I think this there's a particularly strong index of this context in this Atoms for Peace exhibition. We see a newspaper article about this here. This was an exhibition that Arain participated in as a volunteer docent, and he was presenting exhibits that were about non-military uses of nuclear technology. So we see here an image of a docent talking about nuclear uses for treating cancer, and Rashid Arain actually gave tours of a similar exhibition stall. So that's the second context, this technical education institutional sphere that was heavily imbricated in the Cold War context. The third site is Karachi's coffee houses, which were gathering spaces for poets, intellectuals, and oppositional politics. And Arain has reported that he regularly skipped classes from his engineering education and gathered instead in the coffee houses and tea houses, many of which were kind of clustered around the Karachi central area, Saddar, and part of this multi-class space that we're focusing on. And it was within these coffee houses that he accessed European intellectuals, people like Jean-Paul Sartre, Camus, Bertrand Russell, so ideas of existentialism, American beat poetry. So here, I think it was not only a site of oppositional politics in Karachi, where leftists and communist intellectuals would gather, but it was also a site where oppositional transnational discourses were circulated. So finally, the last site I'd like to address is Karachi's growing mainstream art institutional sphere. And we see here an image of Karachi's Arts Council, the building that was constructed by architect Tajuddin Bahmani in 1960. And the Karachi Arts Council was initially founded as a society immediately after independence. It was founded by a group of business people, bureaucrats, and intellectuals. So it was closely imbricated in the growing kind of governmental and diplomatic sphere in Karachi as Pakistan's new capital. And Arain actually presented his first large-scale solo exhibition here in 1963. And I think what is particularly interesting about this mainstream, what I'd like to call as mainstream kind of artistic scene, is the level of its imbrication with diplomatic institutions. So it was a practice that artists would invite consulars and embassy figures to inaugurate the exhibition. Many people invited, British and American diplomats to inaugurate their exhibition. So it was really quite a site of, soft power. And within this context, Rashid Arain presented a series of paintings focused on wind catchers, figure of wind catchers, which were prominent at the time in Hyderabad. No longer are prominent in the city, but have now kind of become a regional symbol, I think. So there's a echo of regional heritage here as well. So I think there's then a convergence of these four sites in another aspect of Arain's practice, which was his self-taught architectural work. He contributed to the design of two houses built, one in SMCH Society in 1957, and the second in Nazimabad in 1961, which his family actually still lives in today. And so we see here the blueprint of his Nazimabad house. And I won't kind of linger on this, unfortunately, given the time, but I think two aspects I'd like to point out are in the blueprint, the way that, and I have to thank Marvi for speaking with me about Rashid Arain's architectural practice, but the way that the communal space is organized in a very open manner, and the way in the attention to climate and the circulation of wind. And so we see that the windows are slanted, enabling wind flow, and we see this large jali. And Nazimabad at the time was also a middle class and very cultural neighborhood. So figures like Sadi Khan, another artist, also lived in Nazimabad at the time. Okay, so the way that I conceptualize Arain's modernist formation is in terms of what the anthropologist Michel Rolfe-Trouillot has called the otherwise modern. And so the modern, as Trouillot has described, can be conceptualized as an experience of time defined by newness, a break with the past, and a future that is different than the present. And this experience of time then also has a kind of a spatial and a racializing dimension, which is to say that to conceptualize something as past, we project it elsewhere in space. And so this was a geographic imagination that underpinned colonialism, the idea that, quote unquote, less developed societies were in need of European tutelage and civilization. And after political decolonization, as Pakistan's trajectory indicates, these racial geographic dynamics as projection of the past elsewhere were reinscribed through economic development programs. This idea that Pakistan had to catch up with the US with the atomic age as fast as possible. So even though the colonial or neo-colonial metropole imaginatively then consigns colonized or quote unquote underdeveloped regions to the past, it also subjects them to the full force of modernizing processes through the violence of racialized accumulation. So the integration of Pakistan into world markets that happened through industrial development in the post-colonial period. So this idea of the otherwise modern then reframes the colonial geographic imaginary by asserting that these so-called peripheries are not playing catch-up, but are actually already intensely modern due to their neo-colonial experiences. So I'd like to conceptualize Arain's artistic practice in Karachi as a critical response to this experience of the otherwise modern. And finally, practically, I think that raises the question of how the otherwise modern manifests in the possibilities and realities of heritage preservation. And so here we can see that the archives of the USIS are actually held mostly in the US and the National Archives there. There's very little record of Karachi's coffee house scenes. And then I think it points to, and this is my last point, it just points to the sort of fruitfulness or productivity in these sort of archives that are semi-private, semi-public, held by families, index individual lives. And so I'd like to conclude by proposing it's really in sites such as Orion's family home that the richest record of heritage in the frame of the otherwise modern appears. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kylie. Really appreciate it. We're going to talk more about the work later in the second section.
Thank you so much for your words. I have just like two pieces of very quick reflection that I'll just go over. You talked about Karachi coffee houses, and that very beautifully ties into this topic that we have been trying to work on ourselves as well. This idea of like cultural spaces or just coffee houses being spaces for like living heritage or preserving oral history. In the context of Pakistan as a post-colonial state, most of the times universities have become spaces that are trying to play catch up or that are trying to produce, let's say, quote unquote, human capital. So there's like a restriction of spaces where you can just exist, where you can just converse, where you can just have some form of discourse, where you can just have different ideas interacting. And it's a very beautiful point to thing about like coffee houses or places like these. Because when we talk about modern heritage or living heritage, how do we preserve that? How do we look at that? So like the existence of these spaces is like very, very crucial for like any form of artistic exploration or discourse. And secondly, you also talked about like USIS being one of like the spaces. And it's very interesting to see how like in many post-colonial states, like the question of heritage is a very loaded one, because how do you separate like the colonial and the post-colonial? Because even though like around the time of Cold War, we were an independent state, but we were also like a playfield for, new imperialism. We have been for very long, and so many other post-colonial states have been. So how do you tie like tangible heritage and tangible structures into like our lives and into like what is ours, what is theirs? How does that combine into like something, and so that was like a very very interesting idea for me. So thank you so much
for taking the time out to speak to us, Ms. Gilchrist, for your insights. With that, I'd now like to introduce our second panelist of the day, Ms. Manu Fatma. Ms. Manu Fatma is an architect and journalist from Lahore, currently based in Austin. She's written as an architecture critic for many papers in Pakistan and has also been published for her fiction. She runs a biannual magazine, Astana, where she looks for narratives that challenge the design world. The second issue is set to release in July. Ms. Manu, thank you for joining us. If you could please share with us some words about your work as an individual and with your initiative, and how this contributes to our discussion today.
Hi, sorry. Thank you for inviting me, and I've attended a few of the other panels that you've had, and I think it's brilliant how everyone's coming together to talk about everything. That's about the introduction that I have. I'm not working in architecture as an architect at the moment. I'm mostly focused on running my magazine and creating a digital space surrounding the discourse in architecture. But I will elaborate on that in my presentation. I called my presentation the Banarsi Buildings, which might not have been the best name for it, but it's sort of just an experimentative name. And because I am a storyteller and I write fiction, I wanted to start with a fictional world and a story. So I wanted to see what it was like if the roles were reversed, because we talk a lot about the global South, and I mean, the term is very problematic in itself, but would it be possible if there was another way of looking at the world? And so I came up with a story where there's a movement known as the Banarsi movement, which is spread around the world. There's different versions of it in various countries, which pop up as a result of their own interpretation in terms of the culture that they have, how they look at their own religious affiliations. And while nobody knew who was behind this design movement, the name implied a certain designer of Indian origin, with their organic modes of living and a certain ornamental attribute attached to their culture. It is no wonder that people around the world looked for similar designs. And instead of being built with the user manual handed to the client, the Banarsi movement tended to incorporate the many dynamisms of human life that mold the spaces they live in. So this was sort of my take on how living in Pakistan, I felt like there was a more organic way of life as opposed to when I moved to the US. And I'm just going to continue on with just a slight joke on how if it had been the other way around, and if places like Target maybe were influenced by the kind of living spaces and the kind of shopping districts that we're more familiar with, or we used to be more familiar with in Pakistan, how it could have, the world could have been really different today. So famous buildings in the world like the Glass House, the Eiffel Tower, Villa Savoy seem to focus more so on the spacification than learn to figure out where they stood for themselves, which again is sort of a take on when I was looking at buildings in Pakistan and how I wanted them to stand for something, but it's a work in progress. The Book of Curiosities remained the official map of the world where the South was oriented towards the top. Now, what's interesting is that this is an actual real map. This is a map from the 11th century. It was composed in Egypt under the Fatimid caliphs. It's a detailed account of everything that they knew, but it's oriented in a way where they've put themselves on top. And it's interesting to see how there's so many different ways that you can look at the world. So that was the fictional world that I had. But it's what I'm interested in seeing is, what does it mean to really switch things around? Is it as simple as believing that you have the power to stand somewhere? Or like, is it more complicated than that? And obviously it is more complicated than that. But we'll talk about, I'll just elaborate on this as I go further. So gentrification, when I was given the abstract to talk about, the words that really stood out to me were gentrification, talking about heritage, talking about intangible heritage, and talking about how we explore these spaces and what future they have. So we're aware of the gentrification that comes in different shapes and sizes. Our culture has been gentrified. There's lots of different isms of gentrification. We're not sure if our culture should be more Arabic or English or American, or right now there's a huge influence of the military. And all of these isms, they've gentrified all these different kinds of spaces in our lives. The fact that for money, the fact that people collect dollars and they store them as opposed to trusting the rupee, which again is a political conflict, I understand, but it is also a form of gentrification because we're forced to not look at our own currency the same way. So this is, I live in Austin, and Austin is going through a gentrification of its own. And I thought it was interesting to compare the gentrification that I see in Austin as opposed to the kind of gentrification that we talk about when in Pakistan. In Pakistan, when we're talking about gentrification, there's been a lot of debate on whether these organic settlements or these people who have made places their home, but now they're being told to leave those places, and those places are now turning into more commercial hubs for people who might have more money, more influence, and just generally commercializing those spaces in ways that might not feel very familiar to a lot of the Pakistani population. And while that gentrification has also happened here, I find it interesting that the changing of the kind of infrastructure around the city is targeted towards achieving a certain kind of development, which I feel like is an idea that we could, as Pakistanis, think about more. So this is a famous community center, concert space. It was called the Frank Caravan Center, and it was recently demolished because they're building a cancer hospital in its place. And you could think about how people are very attached to this particular structure, but then there's also the case for going into the future or trying to achieve things that might not have been there before. And I just wonder if in Pakistan, somehow we could possibly try to go down that route. And I had to like look over lots of buildings and explore what they stood out for and what they meant to me. I can't say I entirely found an answer to this, but it's an interesting conversation, which I thought should be part of the discourse, which obviously it is. But so it was interesting when Kylie brought up the Karachi Arts Council, because I looked at it a while ago, and I thought it was interesting how, even though it's an arts council, it was built in accordance with the design movement and like the ideologies of the day. But I found it slightly I'm not sure what the better word for this would be, but the fact that it looked like it was a blank slate, that the building could have been anything, and it was the Karachi Arts Council, was something that really stood out to me, because it did feel like when we talk about post-colonial architecture, when we talk about the Cold War era, we have all these terms that we use. We use modern architecture, we use internationalism, we use brutalism, but these are all terms that we've imported, and we try to fit them in with our culture, when maybe we should have been looking for our own terms to be able to, like, we could have had a Karachi Arts Council that was more representative maybe of what art meant to us. And these are just ideas. There's obviously so much more in the whole process that I'm completely stepping over. But it was just interesting to go over the buildings and to explore all these different ideas that buildings have. So when I looked at the HBL Karachi, it was funny to me that this building is used or was used for moon sighting, because it's a bank, and banking in Islam, there's been a tension between there's a writer who spoke about gentrification really early on, and she spoke about how the places that are gentrified used to be places where artists, writers, teachers, professors, they would come together and they would turn that space and give it more character. And what happened was that then capitalists decided that those places could be money-making schemes. And so what's funny to me is that initially the idea of gentrification was to build on the heritage that we have, but then eventually it just turned into another place where only rich people could go. And so that's where I wanted to end. That's something that we're trying to do. And this is not an advertising of my platform, but it's more so that I wanted to be able to see how we could bring out those ideologies and how we could work on our own movements and our own design ideas and bring them forward and have them as part of our own heritage, as opposed to looking at it from an outsider's perspective. And so what we're doing is we're trying to mix in the digital with the heritage that we have. Especially because I went into architecture wanting to work on heritage, but I eventually sort of tilted towards a more futuristic sort of approach, which I'm trying to now bring the two together and somehow create a platform where if we could have enough pieces of our own design, and not just architecture, I speak about architecture because I'm an architect, but all kinds of design, and we bring them together, we might be able to make more sense of what it means to us and where we stand, and how having our own names for the design movements that we have might actually change the way that we change those spaces and experience those spaces. And yeah, I think I did I was going to have a few numbers, I think, but that's just general numbers that I thought it just goes to show that we, as people who are on the internet and who do use social media, we have a lot of responsibility to bring all these pieces of heritage and all these different movements together and figure out where we stand and why we stand there. And yeah, that's what I
Thank you so much, Manu. Really appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to see your illustrations, the way that you, I mean, if you can just stop the screen and we can have a look. Yeah. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Would have been very interesting to see those illustrations and kind of like reflect on how the making of that incredible illustrations that you had developed. If we could have talked a little bit more, so maybe in the last section we can talk a little bit more about that. As far as you're talking about the modernity in terms of the architecture in the 60s and the 50s, yeah, there was a lot of international influence, but there was also a lot about like regionality that architects were talking about. So the regional architecture became a really important factor, and which was accommodating the environment, which was accommodating the context. So yeah, I mean, the words might not exist, but there was a lot of thinking process, which I feel like in today's time doesn't exist. They're more like individual buildings, but back then the buildings kind of resonated with the context. So while the arts councils and the embassies were being developed in that spectrum, there was a lot of process of like making of new Pakistan or new ideology. So we can talk more about this in the last section, and of course Randhir can expand on that part. We're looking forward to your presentation, Randhir. So I would let my colleague introduce you, and then we can move forward. Thank you again, Manur. Really appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you so much for taking the time out to speak to us, Ms. Manur. With that, I'd now like to introduce our final panelist of the day, Mr. Randhir Singh. Mr. Randhir Singh is an architect who earned his Bachelor of Architecture and Bachelor of Science degrees from the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in New York in 1999. He worked as an architect in New York for 15 years while studying photography at the International Center of Photography. In 2013, he moved to New Delhi to focus on photography, specializing in architecture and urbanism. He is now based in Barcelona. Singh is working on a series of photography-based books titled Modern South Asia, featuring visual essays on historic buildings with new writings and drawings. Singh's Modern South Asia series features visual essays on historic buildings by architects like Balkrishna V. Doshi and Charles Correa. His work was showcased at the MoMA in 2022 as part of the Project of Independence, and some photographs are now part of the MoMA's permanent collection. His projects include IIT Delhi, a modernist case study, exploring the role of photography in architecture and collaborations with artist Seher Shah, such as Studies in Form. Singh has also photographed Delhi's government housing colonies for his ongoing CPWD project and explored industrial architecture and water towers. His work on the Yamuna River project won the Deutsches Architecture Museum Architecture Book Award in 2018. Mr. Singh, thank you so much for joining us today. If you could please share with us some words about your work as an individual and what's your initiative and how this contributes to our discussion today.
Great, thank you for having me. And yeah, I think what I will talk about will kind of segue nicely from the earlier conversation. I'm just doing the desktop, right? Yeah, I just do the desktop. Yeah, all right, great. So let me play this. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about just modernism in South Asia. And in particular, as you had mentioned, this Modern South Asia book project that I've been working on. But the launching pad for all this work, in some respects, has been the Project of Independence exhibition that was organized by MoMA in 2022. I started working on this in 2019. The whole thing was, delayed quite massively by COVID. But the show finally came out in 2022. And through this project, what I want to share with the group here is just the incredible range of buildings and sites and locations that I was able to visit. I photographed about almost 100 projects across 4 countries during this time. And I'm just going to share these photographs. And I think in the conversation about what is our heritage as South Asians? I'll just use the word South Asians because it gets complicated when you start getting into Indian and Pakistani and Bangladeshi. Our heritage, I think there's the definitions of heritage are the way we understand it currently, I think is very narrow. And especially in the realm of architecture, I think it should be something that's considered much more broadly. So projects such as Habib Fida Ali's, projects in Karachi, this is the 17th Street house, should very much fall into this sort of gambit. This is Anwar Saeed's work in Islamabad, and one of the great things about this MoMA exhibition was just, for me, was the ability to go and see all of this work. I started off as an architect, but I've spent probably 20 years or so really thinking about photography quite a bit, and how architecture is, and how images of South Asia are presented. And in my work, I'm like very conscious of the image and what is included in the image. This is Jeffrey Bawa's work in Sri Lanka. So, there is a lot of kind of exoticizing of South Asia in imagery. And that's something that in my work, I'm like very keen to avoid. So I've made jokes about it, but you won't see any cows in my photographs. There won't be any holy men. There won't be any monkeys. These are all choices that I make as a photographer in how I choose to talk about the projects that I am photographing. I'm just going to move through these like quite quickly and just talk about the work. Again, Jeffrey Bawa's work in Colombo. This is number 11, which is where he lived. This is Valentin Gunasekara's Jesuit Chapel in Colombo. Beautiful little project. Unfortunately, did not make it into the exhibition, nor this house, also in Colombo. So for me, it was wonderful to visit projects, like this little planetarium, which is just a beautiful, like folded plate, structural concrete building, very unusual. It was not designed as a planetarium. I think it was designed for like a World's Fair kind of event. It's the National Archives by Panini Tenakun. This is Minette de Selva, one of the only women represented in the MoMA exhibition. There was a little bit on Yasmin Lari. But the role of women in architecture in South Asia remains very poorly researched, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that realm. This is Mazharul Islam's Fine Arts Faculty in Dhaka. Beautiful little building with this lovely courtyard space in the middle of it. It's a library he did for Dhaka University. Again, like Mazharul Islam was not an architect that I really knew much about until I started going to Bangladesh and photographing over there. This is student housing that he's done in Chittagong. They look like they're in a state of utter ruin, but it's just because it rains a lot and you get a lot of this kind of black finish on the thing. It's Daniel Dunham and Robert Bowie's Kamlapur railway station. Again, like folded plate, concrete. Obviously, Louis Kahn, the National Assembly. So, as I've spent time photographing these kinds of projects and looking at them, I think that if any architecture is built in the subcontinent, then it is an architecture of that subcontinent. And so for an Indian or for a Bangladeshi, this is Bangladeshi architecture, and it should very much be understood in that context. Corbusier designed the UN building in New York. The UN building is very much part of American architecture, as it should be. But for some reason, we have this kind of issue, across South Asia, I think, where we feel like if a foreign architect did a project over there, that it doesn't belong to us, and it belongs to, the Swiss or whatever. It's not the case. This is B.V. Doshi, Premabai Hall. Doshi is the only Pritzker Prize winning architect from the region. I was very fortunate to meet him. I had tea with him, which was great. This is the architecture school in Ahmedabad. So, influences on his work, you can clearly see where a lot of his influences are coming from. But there's always this kind of inventiveness and playfulness in what they're doing. This is Charles Correa, and I should actually add to this Mahendra Raj, who's a structural engineer, without whom this project would not have been possible, and many, many other projects. This is Gira and Gautam Sarabhai. This is the BM Institute for Mental Health. Beautiful, quiet little project that almost nobody knows anything about. This is Achyut Kanvinde's Atira in Ahmedabad. Kanvinde is one of the giants in India of modernism. Amazing, amazing architect. This is Dudhsagar Dairy that he did outside Ahmedabad. I mean, this is a dairy processing plant. It looks like, you know, like a factory out of an animation or something. It's amazing. This is Indian Institute of Technology, the library in Kanpur. And then, you know, older projects actually. So this is Golconda Ashram, which was designed by Antonin Raymond, Nakashima, Francois Sama, and Chandalal Shah, and with the mother, who was the head of the Golconda Ashram, along with Swami Vivekananda. Laurie Baker's India Coffee House in Trivandrum. Loyola Chapel in Trivandrum. Laurie Baker was an American architect who moved and spent his entire life living and working in Trivandrum. Center for Development Studies that he did there. This is Charles Correa, Kanchenjunga Apartments, like quite a famous building, and really well respected worldwide for how it handles like climatic conditions in Bombay. This is Habib Rahman's Gandhi Ghat in Calcutta, done for, well, for Gandhi, obviously. And Kuldeep Singh Mahendra Raj, the Coimbatore Flower Market in Chennai. Beautiful, beautiful project, really spectacular. Another collaboration between Kuldeep and Mahendra Raj is the NCDC building in Delhi. In the distance to the right, you can see Qutub Minar, for those of you who are familiar with Delhi. Delhi is a very flat city, so when you get up above the trees, you really get amazing sightlines. This is the NDMC, also Kuldeep Singh, Mahendra Raj. So this is Habib Rahman again. So this is something that I'd worked on quite a lot. Spent years photographing government housing projects. In Delhi, a lot of these have been torn down and are being replaced with sort of high rises, just changing the nature of the city quite a bit. But these were very influenced by the Bauhaus movement. Again, Habib Rahman's Lalit Kala Academy, which is like an art center, working with, you know, identifiably South Asian motifs like the Jali, but then using them in different ways and playing with things in different ways, and different kinds of programming. Just down the road from Lalit Kala is the Shriram Center, which is Shivnath Prasad, and the structural engineer was Mahendra Raj. It's a performing arts center. Across the road from it, just behind it, is Triveni Kala Sangam, which is another performing arts center. This is Joseph Stein, another American architect who settled in India and spent his entire life working there. This is the auditorium at the India International Center that he did in Delhi. And this is Raj Rewal, STC building, again with Mahendra Raj as structural engineer. It's, I think, probably one of the tallest buildings in Delhi. Raj Rewal's Asian Games Village, which is very well known and has been studied quite a bit. And this is the Hall of Nations, Raj Rewal and Mahendra Raj, Hall of Nations, Hall of Industries. This building was actually demolished in 2017. And I photographed this in 2015, I think. The current government demolished it to make way for a new world-class, as they put it, convention hall facility, which looks like, I don't know, some sort of alien spaceship has like landed. It's hideous. But anyway, this was a really spectacular, you know, project, which unfortunately didn't survive. So just coming around to modern South Asia, this is a series of books that I've been working on. Each book looks at a single project in detail. There's essays, each book has an essay, newly commissioned writing on it, a few drawings. But the idea is really to create like photo books. As an architecture student, you know, 95% or 99% of the buildings you study through books. and through, you understand the architecture through photographs and drawings and writing. You get to visit very few buildings. The problem we have is there's so little publishing in architecture. So my thought was, I wanted to create books that I thought would be useful to students in understanding, buildings. So the general format of the books, they're about 128 pages, just very simply laid out. The first one has an essay by Qazi Khalid Ashraf, who's the director of the Bengal Institute. He wrote this beautiful essay on Doshi's IIM Bangalore. There's drawings, and then there's photographs, of the project. The idea with these books is to, I hope to keep publishing them until I die. So I have at least 40 years, I hope, with good health. And I'm doing 4 a year, so there should be like 200 books, hopefully, so by the end of it. And I am working on distributing these to universities across the region. We have a 25% of the print run is set aside to distribute to universities free of cost. Getting them to Pakistan is a challenge from India, as you can imagine, but we will work it out and figure it out. That's all I have.
Thank you so much, Randhir. This is really exciting to see, especially what a treat to go through these photographs and revisit them in this visual manner. 2-3 things popped up, and I'm so glad that you brought Pragmati Maidan as part of your visual narrative. What a tragedy and what a loss. I would love to talk a little bit more about that in the section where such buildings are demolished in matter of like keeping a layout of thinking of development and thinking of shining, India or shining future of the future. Maybe we also go through this on quite a regular basis. And we haven't really, and this is one of the reasons this particular session that we wanted to bring in, looking at Kylie's work, looking at Manur's illustrations and how she's archiving in a way, and then looking at what your wonderful publications is doing. By the way, just as a footnote, via Dubai, you can send the books to Pakistan. So we will, I would love to have and have it in the library. So please, if I could be of any help in getting those books here, would love to keep them for students. So
Great,
let me know.
chat.
I can support you. Yeah, absolutely. I can even travel to Dubai and bring them on here. We would love to have them because, the South Asian narrative is missing so much in the architecture. We are teaching in such isolation right now in all of these that we don't have any cross dialogue or cross pollination of ideas and alliances and communities. That there's a lot of conversation missing. And why this idea, I'm so glad there's a representative from the government also right now in our audience. We keep on thinking about heritage from a very nostalgic and a romantic perspective, and we need to keep updating our channel by thinking that the policies do not stop till archaeological or antiquities. We need to keep updating our policies of thinking how to accommodate new heritage, this everyday heritage. And that's why Kylie's work, like when she was talking about Rashid Arayan's private space, that itself is a testimony of the future, because that Nazimabad holds such incredible architecture, which is missing out because we're so focused in Old Town that we're not thinking about the making of new heritage and increasing the inventory. How do you initiate the increasing of the inventory is becomes such an important conversation here. I know that Mumbai is doing incredible work in Art Deco. But here we are still stuck with what the listing was done in 1994 by the Sindh Act. We haven't really gone beyond that. On that note, I'm going to open it up. And if anybody wants to reflect and talk about this idea of making new repository or new inventory, please jump in and let's talk a little bit about that. I would be really interested to hear from you, Randhir. What do you think when the cost of that building took place?
I do have some thoughts. So the problem in India, which I imagine is a problem everywhere, if the building is less than something like 80 years or 100 years old, it doesn't qualify for heritage protection in India, which is how they were able to demolish the Hall of Nations, and how many other modernist buildings are being demolished as well. Because also, India embarked on a massive project of architecture building on government land. All those buildings are old now, and that land has become very valuable. So the babus and the government also look at it as how much money can they make off the thing, and the thing gets demolished, and something new will come up. And but I think something you mentioned earlier, which I also want to kind of reinforce, is the importance of like contemporary documentation of, especially of architecture. In the last 10 years living in India, I've met many students, and I've been talking to them about how they study architecture and who are the architects that they are studying and they know about. Everyone knows, the Japanese architects, they know the European architects, the big names, but they know almost nobody from India. I mean, for example, forget Bangladesh or Pakistan or Sri Lanka. Maybe Jeffrey Bawa, mushkil se. But beyond that, there's no knowledge. And even amongst those architects, the photographs that are available out there are black and white photographs that were made perhaps when the building was first completed. Architecture isn't built for that moment of completion. Architecture is built for decades. And I think we do a great disservice to our architecture by not going back and reevaluating the buildings, re-photographing them, and talking about them. Because this is standard practice elsewhere in the world. No building of any importance is only photographed once. People go back and look at it later on. Even things like...
Absolutely, I agree, because constant documentation makes you also look at the idea of maintenance and repair, which is again missing. Once you build the building and you move forward and you build another building, but there's no coming back to it by looking at logs and looking at documentation from the perspective of the politics of repair, which is again missing. The ethics of care architecture is a huge chunk where you showed us the apartment buildings, for example, that low scale. Those public housing. Lots. We did an apartment study as part of my studio practice, and we did this incredible low scale, and we were kind of like thinking about what does scale mean, right? So the ideology is now that, in the small square foot area, how high can we go? And then the low scale structures became intimidated, and they become the backyard of the main new architecture. So in that context, this becomes really important, the constant documentation and constant visual narratives. We have some set of questions here, and I would like to ask my colleagues if Kylie, if you would like to go back to your the first, any like you want to give some feedback on the query.
Absolutely. In terms of the point in the response, I think one of the most significant themes there is this question of transnational heritage, but also transnational heritage that's situated. And I think one key dimension of this idea of the otherwise modern that I use to conceptualize Rashid Aran's modernism is the way that he produces something original precisely through the critical appropriation of what comes from elsewhere or what is imposed from elsewhere. And I think that gesture of claiming and reinventing in a new context to suit new purposes is really key. And I think we could also see that, in architectural contexts as well. I also wanted to touch on a comment in the chat about this question of public and private, or the coffee house's question, and then sorry, I'm just finding it.
Should I read it out? Posting the observation for Ms. Kylie in here for later reflection. Spaces like coffee houses are crucial for living heritage plus discourse of exchange of ideas. We barely have any cultural spaces now. There are also questions of how we detach tangible heritage and coloniality in post-colonial states like Pakistan, where many structures date back to colonial times or are influenced by neo-imperialist powers, ties into a wider question of reclamation.
Yeah, and I think in response to that, one thing I didn't have time to mention in the papers or in the talk is that Aran's family home is both his family home, but it also is a gallery. So he has exhibited works there and invited in the public. He invited me and fellow researchers in. And I know that Aran's brother has at one point tried to reach out to a local school and invite in students. I don't think it was very successful, but I think there's a real question about how could that space or spaces in Nazimabad with this kind of artistic or architectural history become more public, and what then is, is there a reclaiming or transformative gesture in breaking down a lot of the barriers that are, I think, resulting from the really destructive consequences of the post-colonial development process, right? The stratification of wealth and class and the security environment that I think we could all trace back, to these political and economic processes.
Thanks. Manal, you had the question?
I have a question for everyone as well, and I have a question specific for Ms. Mahanur as well. I'll just pose the question for Ms. Mahanur first. So when you started talking about switching things around and the world building that you were doing initially, it made me think about how what globalization means for heritage and architecture, because we often see globalization or maybe not often, but at times as something that's the export of ideas or practices or art from the West to the East, following a very linear idea of history and transmission. But my question is when we talk about globalization and the kind of the narrative building that you were doing in the start, can it serve as a way to challenge Eurocentric ideas of architecture, of art, and can it be a way to for South Asian art, for South Asian architecture and models, etc., to just be more around the world for different forms of architecture and art to combine into something maybe new?
Manu, you can of course connect this to your project of Astana. I mean, you can talk about it in reflection of that. Yeah. I know that you're not an architect, but you can kind of connect it.
No, I am an architect.
Practicing, you're working on
Oh.
Astana is not a design practice based, right? You're doing more reflection based.
Yes. So, yeah, I will elaborate on that because I wasn't able to completely explain my project during the presentation. In response to Manahil, I mean, I think that is very possible. It's sort of like the expat immigrant thing, how when someone moves to places like Pakistan, they'd be expats, but if we move to the US, we're immigrants. Although the concept is the same. I think that is a very possible thing. Just to connect this to Astana. Astana is not meant to be a place. It's not an illustration per se. It's meant to be a digital physical space. So why I think that could be an answer is because I feel like if we have a space accessible to everyone, but we have our physical structures present there digitally, we're giving more people the chance to explore them and to see what it means for them. We're giving more people the chance to really look into what all those structures, what they represent, how they're designed, things that people think about them, things that how architects address these issues. And I completely agree with the idea on how all those buildings that I was talking about earlier, they are all a part of Pakistani culture. They are Pakistani architecture. But they can collectively also represent more of Pakistan, right? There could be it's very hard to talk about a certain movement in Pakistan, and I feel like if we could have all these buildings, have all these design movements, all these design ideas, even art and culture and crafts, and there's just so much more to it than just architecture, obviously. If we can have a space where we collectively combine them and then we're able to assess them, even though we might be putting ourselves, we might be dissociating ourselves from that space of heritage or from that space of the built environment, but maybe that's what we need to see why it is that this linear progression has stayed from, from the West to the East and not from the East to the West. I'm not sure if that answers the question properly, but yeah, I think that is my point of view.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, Zaina, go ahead.
I just wanted to ask, and this is directed at anyone who wants to answer. When it comes to a lot of the discussion about, architecture right now, heritage, modern heritage right now, architectural or otherwise, then there's also the question of like, who knows about this? Who are we kind of like talking to? Who are we trying to transmit this knowledge to, right? When it comes to architectural education, are we just going to target architecture students, or is there a wider sharing of heritage that needs to take place? In this context, what are some avenues that like from your personal experience or just, theoretical, what you've seen in other places in the world, what are spaces or initiatives where this kind of, where, the dissemination of this information and heritage can take place? Stuff like heritage walks or, in schools, books, digital spaces. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Maybe Randhir, you can respond and then Kylie can.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say the architecture students are probably the starting point for this kind of education. I think it's at least the architecture students, I feel it's quite dire because I feel like the education that they're getting right now is so lacking in the architecture from the region, and this is like low-hanging fruit that should be fairly easy to deal with. Working with the public at large becomes a little bit more complicated. I do think heritage walks are a wonderful idea, and I think that they should be expanded to include modern architecture. Why is it that the heritage walks are only ever looking at much older buildings and older neighborhoods? So I'm sure there's ways to figure these things out, or you simply, you have like you have tours of modernist buildings, and I think it'd be interesting, and I think people would want to go and want to see these things. I know for a fact that at least in India, people would fly from all over the world to Chandigarh to see the architecture, and they'll do a Chandigarh and Ahmedabad, little kind of route and pilgrimage. But there's almost no effort that's put into actually formalizing this in any meaningful way. There are small, independent groups that are trying to do this in Chandigarh in particular, but the government doesn't really see much value in this, I think, from the tourism standpoint. I think it's a real missed opportunity. This, again, part of the whole education question.
Yeah, I think thanks for that point. I mean, this question of who Orion's heritage or architecture or artwork is for, I think is really interesting. And I think in the educational context, the way that I teach art history is really as a transdisciplinary subject. So I think what I find interesting about artworks, and I think it extends to architecture too, is the way it cuts across so many fields of study to tell specific kind of historical narrative. And I think that can be opened up to non-university publics, ideally through a lot of mediation. But I think maybe conversely, what we could flip that question around and say, what does this artwork point to in terms of specific kind of open space or a communal space or a multi-class discursive space? Like what does an artwork register that a social context enabled? So that would be my response. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kylie. That really helps. And Randhir's point, of course, it is now very important to think anthropologically and ethnographically, like how these spaces are corresponding to the city. We're going to take our last question. Mariam, why don't you jump in? I'm excited to hear from you. Thanks.
Hello, hi Marvi. Hello, everyone else. Thank you so much for such a great session. It was so refreshing to see breathing spaces, communal spaces, in architecture, in the design of cities, in the way that everyone presented. And I was thinking, it got me thinking that increasingly our idea of modernity and development in our South Asian cities, it's obsessed with this idea of maximum output, just maximizing output, whether it's in housing units or whether it's in car parking, or maximum output in getting as many cars on the street as possible. So we're just obsessed and utilizing that as a way to justify our costs and everything. So it was really refreshing, but I know that it's not only a visual element, the breathing spaces, the communal spaces, the use of different materiality in air. It's not only a visual element, it has an important climate rationale behind it. So I was just wondering if in your experiences, there have been examples or there have been precedents where people have been able to convince governments or the development sector of the value of these breathing spaces of care-based architecture, um, and you and is there hope for this in the future, or do you really just need to rely on a champion to come up and just set the precedent?
If I may.
Manur and Ranjir both can respond to this.
Yeah, if I may. I think there's much to be optimistic about. I don't think any of us can do any of the work we do unless you're optimistic about the future. I mean, it's, I think there's a lot to be optimistic about, and I feel that the steps have been taken here today, or in many of these kinds of forums across the region, really point to an understanding of the need to create the kinds of spaces that you're sort of describing, and to try and figure out how to reclaim public space in a manner that benefits the groups that are kind of living in those spaces and kind of inhabiting them. So I'm very optimistic, though. I think we're headed in the right direction.
I think it's something, what you said was very important. And I also think having the community at large participate in the architectural and urban decisions is very important. So something which I feel like is lacking in Pakistan is the presence of an architecture critic in newspapers and magazines. A lot of the really famous authors were architecture critics for, we have The Guardian, we have the New York Times, and these people have had a lot of power because not only are they not afraid to critique what architects and urban planners are doing, but they're also looking out for what the people want and what is better for them. It's like that middle ground. And I feel like if we were to be able to work on that, and I have been trying to by writing for different papers, but I think that's a very important thing that I feel like students could also start working on, because as soon as you jump into design, you have to trust that you are allowed to have an opinion of your own, and you do have to build on that, and it has to be an educated opinion, but that is where better design comes from. But yeah, so I believe the community at large should be involved in those steps.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much, Manur. I mean, that's a comment that's very close to my heart. And I feel like the architecture students need 3-4 kind of trajectories, that they need to be advocates, they need to be writing more about built environment, and they need to be not only just on from the desk, the design work, but also need to be doing is documentation and looking at the city from a very closer lens. On that note, as I promised that the session won't be more than 1.5 hours, we've just reached on time. So again, if there are any pressing comments, Randir, I just had one more thing, that if you could link us up with some articles on this MoMA exhibition that the students can read. If you can leave a couple of links for us, that would be great. Any publication that one can download on that exhibition that we would like to share it. Same as Kylie and Manur, if you want to leave any links to your work practice or Astana's link, if you want to just post it into our chat box, that would be great. In that way that we'll have, a list of like looking at it. And then while we are minuting and making a report of this session, we can include those links into our work. So if that's okay with you, I'll give you a minute to do that. If you can just post a little bit of your links in the chat box, something maybe you want us to read, Kylie, any kind of like on ethos of modernity, any article, any academic paper, anything that you think would initiate this conversation more. I'll just give you guys a minute. You can post it into our chat box.
I'm just going to add the link to the LinkedIn page because we're a part of an accelerator program, and we're going to launch our website in about a month, but I can't show it right now. So
Sure. You can post anything that you think is relevant to today's talk.
Okay.
I'm going to give you like 30 to 40 seconds. You can do your take your time. And then on that note, we will say goodbye and thank you for coming in.
Thank you so much, everyone, for speaking with us today. And we really appreciate your insights on the topic. Now, I'd like to finally close the session. Thank you, everyone, for your time.